McLaren were the first team to unveil their actual 2025 car, the MCL39, in Silverstone in a very special papaya camo livery, and it's just the perfect time to look ahead at their drivers and also the team itself, because I think it's fair to say that they're going into the season as the favourites for both the drivers and also the constructors' title. They ended 2024 in the absolute best way that they could by winning the Constructors' title and also absolutely dominating the final race of the season with Lando in Abu Dhabi. It was very reminiscent for me of Max in 2020 because he also won the 2020 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and then of course went on to challenge and win the championship in 2021. That momentum is actually really important, especially going into the final year of a regulation cycle, because it just shows that your team is on the right trajectory and also gives the drivers and also the team back at the factory a huge amount of confidence during the off-season and also to start the next. That is going to be one of McLaren's biggest priorities in 2025, to be challenging for race wins and also the championship from the very first race. They can't afford to put themselves and also their drivers under pressure and playing catch-up yet again, because not only is it going to have consequences for this season, but it's also going to have consequences for next. McLaren is one of those teams that, unlike an Aston Martin or an Audi, they can't just abandon this season. They have a genuine chance of winning the 2025 Drivers and Constructors' Championship, and I think their job of choosing when to switch the development race and go all in on 2026 is going to be more difficult than any other team, because they are going to want to be competitive all the way from Australia till Abu Dhabi. In terms of McLaren themselves and what they need to improve on for this season, I think their biggest asset is their car development. Their car should be the fastest to start the season because they seem to understand their car better than anyone else. They have amazing correlation with their upgrades. It seems like every single time they put a major package on their car, it almost always delivers performance and they never really get lost with it. If you look at Red Bull and Ferrari last season, they definitely had noticeable dips during the middle part of the year where they got a little bit lost with either the development or balance of their car. And when you look at Mercedes, I mean, their car has been so inconsistent that there is no way that they have a better understanding of these regulations even now than McLaren. As I mentioned earlier, the one thing that I think McLaren is going to find quite tricky is to know how to judge the 25 development with 26, because there is now a lot of expectations on Andrea Stella, McLaren, Lando and even Oscar to wrap up these championships. And with that expectation comes a lot of pressure. They're going to feel that pressure to get these titles wrapped up this season, but they can't afford to just abandon next season and develop all the way till the end of the season. Knowing when the right time to abandon 25 and move on to 26 is going to be the hardest challenge for this team, and I think for the development team, they're going to find themselves in a similar spot to Red Bull in 2021 because they were also under a very similar pressure to win in that season. The next thing that I think McLaren might find quite tricky to manage is their drivers. And now I mean this in a positive sense because I think they have a great driver lineup. I think their driver lineup is pretty future-proof given the ages of both of their drivers and also that they're both tied down to fairly long contracts. However, even Piastri has mentioned that they have already discussed the possibility of team orders and that they'll only be implemented at the end of the season when the drivers and also the Constructors' Championship is a little bit more clear. I think their biggest goal should just be to not overcomplicate the rules of engagement. The whole papaya rules last year was just a little bit ridiculous. I think it actually backfired a little bit, and what happened in Monza when Lando was fighting for the driver's title and Oscar still went for that move. There was clearly some miscommunication between the drivers and also the team, and I think that's something that they're going to have to get on top of and be a lot clearer about, especially towards the end of the year. And now, again, McLaren kind of have a good problem to have in the sense that they have two very competitive drivers, similar to Ferrari in that sense as well. I think McLaren and Ferrari kind of stand apart from Red Bull and Mercedes, who have a much more traditional number one and number two dynamic, and that can both be a positive and also a negative. We still don't know by how much Piastri is going to improve in 2025 and how they manage a potential situation where Oscar is taking points away from Lando, or maybe even Lando is taking points away from Oscar if Oscar's the one to fight for the drivers. That's going to be a tricky one for Andrea Stella to manage, but it's going to be a very important one because they need to have a clear point in the season where perhaps they try to focus their attention on one driver over the other, and that other driver has to be on the same page as the entire team for the better of the team. The last major bullet point that McLaren are really going to have to focus on is the consistency of their strategy. That is going to need to be maintained throughout 2025, especially as the pressure of that title battle is going to reach volcanic levels, because in 2024 they definitely made a few major errors in Canada and also in Silverstone, which cost their drivers wins. Despite losing those wins in those two races, or taking those wins away from their drivers, I think some people would argue, I think it's fair to say that as the season went on, their strategy wasn't kind of called into question. It wasn't a big talking point, if I remember correctly, and so it does show that the team definitely progressed, but they've got to continue that. The hallmark of a championship team, and this is not just in Formula 1, it's in any sport, is that they continue and they maintain standards across multiple years, and that is what McLaren are going to have to continue to do. They have got to be more brave, because in Canada and Silverstone they were just way too cautious, leaving Lando out one lap too late in Canada and losing him the lead, not double stacking and also pitting Oscar on the right lap right behind Lando in Silverstone. They seem to be reacting to what Red Bull were doing instead of dictating the strategy themselves when they were leading the race. It was definitely the hallmark of a team that just wasn't very used to being at the front of the field. It was a team that kind of buckled under the pressure a little bit on the pit wall and made the job for their drivers a lot harder than it should have been. And now, it's not that McLaren are bad on the operational side. I mean, they're actually one of the best on the grid, but when you want to become champions both in the drivers and constructors, you've got to analyze and critique yourself to the nth degree. You've got to look for those marginal gains, because when the benchmark is Red Bull, who are undoubtedly the best team on the operational side, you've got to be harsh on yourself. And yet again, in 2024, the DHL pit stop champions were Red Bull. In second place, it was, surprise, surprise, McLaren. So you want to make the job even easier for your drivers, and so they're going to have to look at their pit stops, they're going to have to look at their strategy to become the best of the best. They need to become more assertive in their strategy, they need to have more trust in their pit crews and more confidence that they can get the job done, like a crucial double stack in tricky crossover conditions, and also not being too cautious of what the other teams are doing and dictating strategy, especially when they're in the lead of the race. And next up, let's talk about all of the things that Oscar Piastri will need to improve on this season. Last year he was really inconsistent, which was actually quite difficult to watch, because you had these amazing highs, these exceptional races like a Baku and a Hungary, but then there were also some pretty big troughs, and I mean they were really hard to watch, especially when on the other side of the garage, Lando was battling for race wins. In races like Spain and Brazil, where they clearly had a race-winning car, Oscar Piastri was just nowhere, barely scraping the points in the bottom half of the top 10. That is just something that cannot happen this season if Oscar wants to be a title contender. Even though he had an amazing kind of breakout year last year, the truth is, and I think this actually went a little bit under the radar because maybe people gave him a pass for his inexperience, he actually got dominated by Lando in 2024. In qualifying, he lost out 20-4 in their head-to-head, and he was also outscored by 82 points. And now, in a championship battle, that is basically a domination job. So that is something that he has to improve on if he wants to be considered a title contender and amongst the best drivers on the grid, because now, in his third year of Formula 1, I think that excuse, which is a genuine excuse of inexperience, basically doesn't become an excuse anymore. Oscar during the preseason has been very clear with what he expects from himself and where he needs to improve. Just like with the team and also with Lando, it's not that they're being cocky or overconfident. This is a team that has just this self-assuredness in themselves that they are going into a championship fight, and so they need to have that championship mentality from day one to be just as good as Red Bull off track and just as good as Max on track. Oscar knows that his number one priority is going to be qualifying pace because, quite honestly, it just wasn't good enough. Too often he was on the back foot and having to make recovery drives during a crucial race when he clearly had the car to win it, and he also needs to make a few more improvements in wet races because he wasn't particularly strong in races like Canada or Brazil. The team dynamic that continues to develop between these two drivers is going to be very interesting to watch. How that will be established by the end of the year is going to be a massive challenge for Oscar because although he wants to be a title contender, and of course he wants to be the team number one because every single driver does inside of their own team, he has got to earn it through his performances. Lando is a fantastic driver, he is the number one de facto leader if we're being honest, and if Oscar doesn't perform this season, then he is going to corner himself and become Lando's number 2 going forward. How he balances his own ambitions, but also to not take away from the positive environment at the team and not to create any toxicity between him, himself and Lando. That is going to be a very tricky balance for him to judge. Last up, let's talk about Lando. Now, just like Oscar, he also sat down with Lawrence Barretto and did an introspective interview talking and analysing himself and what he needs to improve on for this season. I highly recommend that you go and check it out. And what I found really interesting is that I get a lot of heat from Lando fans, both on my videos and especially on social media, about how I'm apparently a Lando hater because of how critical I was about him last year. But the irony is that a lot of what I said at the back end of last season was echoed by Lando in that interview. He said, even though the majority of the time we were quicker and I had a better car for a lot of the races, which I can happily admit, there were some things where I just didn't do a good enough job. I wasn't simply quite at that level that I needed to be to race against Max. Lando is a very candid and also very truthful person, and contrary to what his fans think, I don't have anything against him. It was just that I think he underdelivered relative to the talent that he has and didn't quite maximize last season, but this year he is only going to get stronger and he is only going to be better based off the experience and the pain of losing the championship last year. He has got the most important aspect of being world champion absolutely on lock. He has got the raw speed to be a world champion, and he has got the raw speed to beat Max Verstappen. 8 pole positions in 2024 is no joke, and if he continues that kind of pole position form in 2025, we are going to have a serious conversation as to whether or not he is perhaps maybe even the best and fastest qualifier on the grid alongside Max and Charles. He just needs to improve on the small little details to really be able to have the confidence from the beginning of the season all the way till the end. Losing the title in the way that he did, again, is going to make him stronger mentally because he has already been through the pain and he's already made those mistakes, so he is going to learn and the pressure is going to be a little bit less because he's experienced it all before. In terms of the small details that he needs to improve on, he actually made in that interview a really good reference to Abu Dhabi last year, where he executed basically a perfect race. Pole position, getting off the line cleanly, and then dominating basically from start to finish. He now knows and he now has the confidence that he can do that every single race for the entirety of the season, and it's just those little things like race starts, for example. Now, whether it was an issue on the operational side, perhaps not being fully comfortable with the clutch as much as the other drivers, or maybe something mental, that is something that he needs to work on for this season, and also getting elbows out, in his words, a little bit more against drivers like Max. Lando this season cannot afford to let Max get a comfortable points margin early on into the year, because Max is the type of driver who's going to take liberties in wheel-to-wheel combat, because he knows once he has a 20, 30 or even 40 point gap to Lando, that Lando has more to lose than him. Sometimes with Max, you've just got to fight fire with fire. And if it means having a crash with him, then let it be. Sometimes it's going to be your fault, sometimes it's going to be his fault, and sometimes it's going to be a racing incident. But you have to stand your ground. Lando has done a fantastic job to look back at last season and, in his own words, look back at the bad races from last year and learn from his mistakes. He knows now that if he just concentrates on himself, that he has confidence in the fact that he can put in incredible pole position laps and dominate races from start to finish, and it's just going to be about concentrating and not overthinking and not letting Max get in his head. McLaren, Piastri and Norris still have a lot to improve on for 2025, but the amazing thing is that after decades and decades of watching teams like Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes fight for championships, for the first time in what feels like certainly my lifetime, we are going into a Formula 1 season with McLaren as the team to beat. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.